Then I got back. And then I was 30 again.
Curious if anybody has seen any like favorite April Fool's pranks on the internet today.
Just people pranking their parents acting like they would you.
Oh.
They'll do the automated those calls, the big ones, and they'll put it up to like the speaker when they call their dad and mom, and it sounds like they're in jail.
Oh no.
Yeah, and so their parents are like freaking out.
Yeah, if I was a parent, I would be terrified.
I know.
I feel like April Fool's pranks were awesome, and I feel like over the last couple of years, people were just like, I need a break. But there have been some interesting ones. There's like a lot of the like fake items from companies. There's one brand that advertised a new mechanical keyboard, but it's just one key. So there's some kind of funny stuff on the internet. I would not fool you into thinking we're pop quiz or something today, because y'all have been through enough already, and I don't want to shock your systems. But welcome back. Happy Friday. Glad to have you all here for today. As a quick recap for last class, we spent some time approaching sort of a basic understanding of communication theory, what communication is and why it matters, including people that are here for the first time. I broke you off into groups to look at 3 different models of communication. Does anybody want to remind us what those 3 models were?
Linear,
Linear,
interactive,
interactive.
transactional.
Correct. Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate that. Those 3 models, right, are about how we transmit and share information through communication. They'll be useful over the course of the term as we look at different communication theories. And we started to talk about how we might use incorporate theory, including concerns related to ethics. Just as a note, a couple of you have done so already, but please complete the first quiz on Canvas by Sunday if you haven't already done so. It covers the first 3 chapters from the textbook, and I have PDFs of those if you don't have access to the textbook yet. I do recommend that you secure access, since you will need that for courses next week. I recommend, again, renting the ebook on Amazon for the 7th edition. It's about $32.33. You can also get the 4th edition from the bookstore, or purchase or rent the older edition. Just make sure you have a plan if you haven't already done so to stay up to date. Last class, I shared the annotated bibliography assignment. That's asking you by the end of the 3rd week to pick a theory from the class and to look at additional sources that discuss or use that theory. So if you want to get a head start on that, you can. We'll talk more about it on Monday, but I want to give you more than 2 weeks to start thinking about it. And then the last thing I wanted to direct you to is the makeup assignment on Canvas. So if you've taken a class with me before, you might be familiar with my model for absences, right? You can have up to 3 absences in a class for whatever reason with no penalty or impact on your grade. If you have more than 3 absences, that would include things like athletic travel and so on, right? Then you can complete a makeup assignment on Canvas. It's about 1 to 1.5 pages, and just asks you to watch the recording from that day and brush up on some of the things that you missed. You can complete that, and then that will get you credit for that day. So your options are come to class face-to-face if you can. If you can't, but you can participate remotely, email me and I'll send you a Zoom link for that day. And if you can't do either, then you can complete the makeup assignment. Again, you get 3 absences that are free. Beyond that, I would ask you to complete it. You'll also notice that I uploaded to Canvas your attendance for last class through completion of activities. I'll take that attendance and continue to do so throughout the term, just to let you keep track of how you're doing. I'll leave it blank until you have 3 absences, and then start adding zeros if you miss more than Any questions about the course in general? Anything we talked about last class before we get started today? Awesome.
We're talking about ethics today.
So we started to hit a little bit on ethics last class. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ethics surrounding theory. Good question. So today, we'll be talking about some of the major contexts and subfields of communication. Again, this is a pretty broad survey course that covers a lot of the things in communication that'll help you gain a sense of where we are in the overall landscape. We'll break down the process of developing theory, what it is and why it matters, and also some of the ways that we'll be testing, critiquing, and analyzing theory in this class, right? As I mentioned before, every theory in this class is open for debate and discussion. There are going to be things that we see as problems or ways that a theory falls short, and I invite us to talk about those things and give you a tool set that lets us critically analyze theory further. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about an overview of theories as well as context. And then I'll ask you to do an individual activity where I'm assigning you an opportunity to look at a tradition and a context. So traditions, you can think about as a kind of historical approach to the study of communication. If communication is about how we use symbols to create meaning and engage with one another, a tradition is an approach or way of thinking that informs how we do work in communication. And again, you don't need to get this all written down word for word since I do have the slides available, but we'll be going over each of these with a couple examples so we can understand where the theories we'll be looking at in class come from. Because each theory in the class is going to come from a different tradition and also come from a different context or subject. The first is rhetorical, right? So the writing department here at EOU has some great courses such as an introduction to rhetoric and critical writing and similar classes that get into some of these things in more detail. Rhetoric is also an area that I specialize in. Rhetoric is how we use persuasion, right? It's how we influence or impact one another through messages. So rhetoric goes all the way back to the Greeks, right? And the rhetorical tradition for folks such as Aristotle was the idea that we use rhetoric to convince other people, you know, whether it's Socrates arguing for his innocence or whether it's the way that you get a used car salesperson who's getting to try to get you to buy something, right? We use rhetoric to persuade and impact one another. One of the critiques, going all the way back to the Greeks, right, was the idea that rhetoric, quote, made the weaker argument the stronger. That is, that rhetoric was not necessarily an art in the same way that we could consider something like music, but instead, because rhetoric has the capacity to deceive, right, or to give us misleading information, that could be a setback of it, right? For instance, if you've seen or heard of, you know, the classic 4 out of 5 dentists would recommend chewing gum, right? Using a rhetorical approach, we know it's trying to persuade us, but if we were to break it down and use the rhetorical tradition, we have a lot of questions, right? Who are these 5 dentists? How were they surveyed? Who's the one dentist who wasn't included? Why did they disagree? Patients who chew gum, right, is an important stipulation. It's not saying everybody would benefit, just for people who chew gum, right? And they got the sugar rules. So we would break down the message and understand its assumptions and how it's trying to persuade us. Rhetoric and its approach, of course, influences the way that we look at things like public speeches, but we also know, especially with things like political polarization, that rhetoric is much more connected to the use of internet, online sources, or gaining information and convincing one another about issues. So the rhetorical approach is analyzing persuasion, and we'll look at some theories, including rhetoric and the narrative paradigm in a little bit more detail, then unpack some of these. Secondarily, we have this idea of semiotics, right? And that'll be important we're getting into next week, the way that we use signs and symbols to communicate, right? Semiotics comes here from Roland Barthes. And Barthes is very interested in the way that we use communication to create meaning, right? The idea, as we talked about, that language is the use of signs or symbols to convey reality. The letters DOG don't necessarily spell out dog, unless unless we understand what each of those things means and put it together. One example, right, is we might see a pedestrian crosswalk sign. We see it and we know, okay, we need to slow down, we need to watch for pedestrians and so on. Semiotics tells us that that symbol is used to convey social reality, that we should slow down and be careful of other people. How many people know what this is or have seen this symbol?
It's not a crosswalk symbol.
So it is, but do you know where this one is from?
Well, I would assume a different country than the United States.
Yeah, so this is the Ampelmann. It's actually the crosswalk symbol in Germany. So I went to Berlin a couple years ago, and they actually have this fellow, who I guess was created several decades ago, to indicate when it's safe to go and cross the street. And interestingly, there's an entire gift shop for the Ampelmann. It's like a little mascot in Germany, right? So how we symbolize when it's safe to cross the street is going to have some differences in signs and how it's represented. We can still get the general idea, green versus red. Red light, green light still freaks me out as a Squid Game, but right, the use of the sign is fairly similar. We can still understand it, but it's still got some major differences in terms of culture and history. Semiotics, how we use signs to communicate, is this approach. Next up, we have phenomenological, right? Phenomenology sounds kind of complicated and weird, right? But phenomenology is about how we're making sense of our own lives and our own perspectives, right? Phenomenology suggests that the phenomena or issues that we experience over the course of our lives have shaped our perspectives and ways of understanding the world, right? To give you an example, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I got bit in the face by a terrier, and that particular breed of terrier kind of freaks me out every time I see them, because I remember when I was a kid and I got bit, right? My experience phenomenologically has shaped my perception and feeling about terriers. So phenomenological looks at that. One way that it does so is through the idea of the Johari window. The Johari window suggests that there are different quadrants and ways of understanding ourselves in relationship to other people. Or if you know Donald Rumsfeld, who previously worked for the George W. Bush administration, he said that there were no knowns, that which is known. There are things we know about ourselves and other people. It might be things like your hobbies, your interests, things about your physical appearance that you choose to share. The known unknowns, right, are things in which other people know about you, but you don't know about yourself. You've got broccoli in your teeth and you're just talking and have no idea that you do. There are things that you know about yourself, but might not choose to share with other people. For instance, right, if there's aspects of your identity that you're not comfortable sharing, if you just lost a job and you're not comfortable talking about it to your parents, might be in that quadrant. And then things that you and other people might not know either. So phenomenology would look at what do we know about ourselves and our experience, and what might other people pick up on with us. The use of feedback using transactional and interactive approaches that we talked about earlier in class are also ways of thinking about how the blind spot or hidden spot utilizes feedback in the communication process. Cybernetic, right? So this sounds a lot more high tech than it is. It's actually fairly straightforward. So cybernetic is not about like the use of AI or anything like that as a tradition in communication. It's instead concerned with the ways in which noise and unpredictability can influence our communication, right? And as we talked about in the class, noise can take on a lot of different forms. It can be physical, psychological, and social, right? To give you one example, we oftentimes, right, would nod our heads up and down to say yes, or shake our heads to indicate no. We use nonverbal communication to confirm to other people. However, in the country of Bulgaria, people actually shake their heads to indicate yes and nod to say no, other way around, right? So if a Bulgarian is trying to communicate with you, yes, I want to go outside, right, and is shaking their head, that unpredictability, noise, and confusion that gets lost in translation could be analyzed using a cybernetic approach, right? This one doesn't come up a lot, but it is useful when we're looking at organizational communication theories and the way that we engage in issues of unpredictability. Then there's socio-psychological, right? And this is looking at cause-effect relationships. One of the theories that we'll be exploring a little ways into the class is known as cultivation theory, right? Coming from Albert Bandura. Cultivation theory argues that as we become more and more exposed to a message or a way of thinking, that we'll start to adopt or believe that message to be true. I'll give you an example. How many people enjoy watching like fictional crime shows, like NCIS, Criminal Minds, those types of shows? Yeah, a lot of you. So cultivation theory suggests that the more and more that we watch those types of shows, the more we come to believe that the law enforcement and criminal justice system is a reflection of what we see on screen. That we tend to think that that's how it works in real life. We might suspend disbelief to an extent, right? But we still have some areas of uncertainty or confusion as to how things play out, right? Or the classic, if you've watched like 2000s era heist movies where you have the hacker character who just like clatters keys on the ground and says, I'm in, right? That's not how hacking works, but the more we see that trope depicted on screen, the more we tend to believe it's true. The socio-psychological theory suggests that if we watch more of this programming, we'll come to believe that that's how hacking works. So socio-psychological is looking at those cause-effect relationships. One issue with this approach, right, is the correlation is not necessarily causation, right? Just because two things are connected in space and time does not mean one thing causes another thing to happen. Good example of this is a lot of funny charts on the internet that correlate two things that are totally unrelated. For instance, the years in which there are more deaths from skiing are also the years in which more people eat mayonnaise. But eating mayonnaise does not cause you to die while skiing, right? So cause-effect relationships can have some limitations. Sociocultural, right? So the best picture winner was a film called Coda. Has anybody seen this movie before? Looks like most of you have not. So Coda, right, is an acronym that stands for Child of a Deaf Adult. The main character of that film is hearing, but her family is deaf. And the film is about that experience and navigating hearing in that process, right? That's an example of sociocultural as a tradition because it's understanding how we create reality together. The film has kind of a mixed reception among members of the deaf community. Some say it's great that we're casting deaf actors in deaf roles, including the Best Supporting Actor winner. Others critique it and say that its representation of deafness as a sort of tragedy or loss, and also its depiction of ASL interpretation in court is not correct. But in any case, right, it's an example of how a family or group creates a culture surrounding things like deaf and hearing related issues. So sociocultural is an approach that understands how we as cultures or members of a group intend to create reality or shared experience together. And then lastly, we have critical, right? This is, I think the term critical gets used and thrown around a lot without a lot of understanding as to what it means, right? Critical is about power, right? Critical theory is about interrogating or investigating where power comes from, how power might influence members of society. For example, spiral of silence theory argues that when somebody is not in the majority opinion on an issue, they might feel uncomfortable or unable to express their perspective, right? Another example is the hashtag #TripTheVote campaign, which is something that I studied in which people with disabilities used the Twitter hashtag to raise awareness about the inaccessibility of voting machines in the United States. They couldn't go and park somewhere that was accessible. They tried to use an accessible voting machine, but it broke down, et cetera, right? So critical theories are looking at those types of issues. So those are the traditions, right? The major traditions in communication theory, the assumptions and beliefs that guide how we do theory. Next, let's talk about context, right? So the key difference between these two is that a tradition is a way of thinking about theory. A context is a situation or population that's selected to analyze or to talk about in theory. there's a good chance that depending on the course that you're taking, that you have taken a class that is one of these followed by communication, such as interpersonal communication, right? In the theories that we'll be going over in this class, there will be a particular group or population that theory is concerned with. Interpersonal theories, we'll get into next week, are concerned with interaction between two people. Mass media theories, larger audience, and so forth. So let's start with intrapersonal. There's not a lot of theories that are intrapersonal. In fact, most of the theories in this class that include it are also going to include interpersonal. Intrapersonal communication is communication with yourself, right? We talked a little bit about that last class, but it's like having a conversation with yourself, getting yourself pumped up for the day. So, interpersonal communication is communication that typically happens between two people. One of our core classes is on interpersonal communication, right? It can happen face-to-face, like a conversation. It can happen through text. It can happen through Zoom. It can happen through a phone call, right? But there is so much that's going on in interactions between two people that it's worth studying and looking into. So that's interpersonal communication. We also have a class called small group communication, right? Small group communication is generally in the 3 to 12 range. A good way of thinking about small group communication is a team. If you're a member of an athletic team, extracurricular, or other group on campus, there's a good chance that you engage in small group communication. A lot of dynamics that tend to play out in smaller groups that we see that are really different than one person. Organizational or OrgComm is a pretty big and significant field within communication, right? If you're involved in an organization, that could be something like ASEOU or another kind of extracurricular or event on campus. It could be involved in your place where you work, nonprofit, so on. But organizational not only looks at human dynamics of those relationships, but also how structures and hierarchies communicate with one another. What, for instance, does power distance look like? Power distance refers to the idea that a supervisor or an employee have different levels of comfort talking to each other. In low power distance, it's open. You talk to your boss pretty casually. At high power distance, it's very formal and infrequent when you talk to a supervisor. Those are all elements of organizational communication. Public and rhetorical communication are about larger audiences. As you could probably imagine, this connects up to the rhetoric tradition a lot of times too. If you've taken a class like public speaking, that looks into the dynamics of public communication reaching a larger audience. We know that public communication has involved the use of live streaming, the use of videos and other sources online too, right? Something like a major speech, such as a State of the Union, would be an example of a public or rhetorical approach, or a guest speaker who comes to the UU campus. Lastly, in terms of larger scale approaches, we have mass and media approaches, right? So jokingly, over the last couple of years, right, there's a joke about Zoom University with the number of courses, things that have happened over Zoom. Some of you might still be in classes that are happening over Zoom, right? Also the use of Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, and so many other outlets, right? Mass and media approaches are looking at how information that's circulated to a large audience, for instance, the streaming wars that we see through a lot of outlets, convey ideas. Media representations matter and shape much of our reality and understanding of social issues, right? For instance, if you're like me and you start watching the really silly reality show on Netflix, Is It Cake? Right, where people make lifelike cakes that look like real objects. That stuff is silly, but it's an example of how things like memes evolve into mass media and enter the public consciousness. And then moving away from media, we also all have cultural approaches, right? There's, of course, we offer here intercultural communication that goes into those issues more if you're interested. Pictured here on the right are the Pirahã, which are an indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. And the Pirahã do not have a word to describe numbers past 3. They'll say there's 1 stick, there's 2 sticks, there's 3 sticks, or there's many sticks. And when asked, like a bundle of 6 sticks versus 7 sticks, the Piraha were not able to communicate a difference between the two. Communication shapes reality, right? And the way that we communicate and the words and language we have shapes the way that we look at the world. That's an example of how we use culture to communicate about and understand one another. Piraha were considered an anumeric population that didn't have words to describe numbers past 3. So given some of these, we've gone through both the traditions as well as contexts, and we'll be doing a lot of theories that you'll find get slotted into some of these different categories. What I want you to do on your own is to pick one tradition and one context of communication. This could be a tradition or context that you find especially interesting or thought-provoking. Based on what we've talked about so far, I want you to write or type how the tradition you've selected would approach the context that you've selected. And then I'd like you to give an example of a topic or issue that the tradition would use to explore topic or context. For instance, right, maybe I want to use a rhetorical tradition to analyze organizational communication. An example of this is I want to understand how a supervisor uses emails to communicate with and persuade their workers to work on the weekend, right? So take some time to think of an example of a tradition, the context that you find interesting, and what it would look like if you put those two things together. Give you about 5 minutes or so to work on. Yeah.
Can you write this on a separate piece of paper to turn it in for today? Or?
Yes. I'll give you a couple more minutes working on this, and I'll ask for a few volunteers. finish up if you're currently writing or working on. So I'm going to ask for a few folks to share the tradition and context that they selected, and then the example that they came up with that ties to those two. Is there anybody who'd like to volunteer? Yeah, go for it.
I said critical and cultural,
Sure.
and that's kind of like about how power dynamics and cultures. An example I use educators or teachers, like in some cultures, it's okay for me to, I guess here it's okay for me to ask you questions
Yeah.
like that, but in other cultures where there's a lot more tradition, it's a lot more controversial. Like I would do books if I ask my teacher questions or things like that. Besides disrespectful and C disrespectful.
Right. Right, that's a good example, right? So critical, right? Looking at the role of power, cultural, looking at some of the differences that we might have in context. You were mentioning, right? Depending on the culture, something like asking questions, speaking out, creating conversation, right? Could look more appropriate here, right? And here I absolutely encourage you, if you have things you want to share, questions you have, to do so. But, right, in something like maybe higher power distance, we might not see that play out the same way, or it would be seen as disrespectful. So that's a good example for sure. JP, what did you come up with here?
I use semiotic and mass media, and I just was talking about how like using symbols and stuff to like make sure that like it's known throughout mass media, like having a logo, something that like means something, and everyone is able to recognize it. And an example, I guess, like I feel like doing a brand change, you need to find a logo that when you recognize it, you know it's that company, you know, reaches out to everybody and can be well known and easily recognized in a mass like population.
Yeah, right. So the use of semiotic approaches through the use of like popular brand names and symbols is a really good example, right? I was looking through like a BuzzFeed listicle the other day. It was like, do you remember this? It was like old brand names and logos. It was surprising, right? We see a lot of logos and brands circulated a lot. And the way that those change over time is oftentimes meant to make their communication look cleaner and easier and more attractive to us to purchase, for sure. Right? And, oh, would you like to share as well?
Yeah, I don't know where it fits, but it's either like, being phenomenological or sociocultural with like interpersonal relationships. They really fascinate me. I was married, I'm now divorced, and like I grew up in the LDS Mormon community all my entire life until recently. I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. And being married to a man who did not understand the certain traditions I grew up with, and like how we were trying to create our own reality to make sense of our marriage.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an example or if that works.
Yeah, it does. It would depend a lot on like what you're looking for or focusing on, right? So phenomenological would be a lot about here's where my experience and background comes into the table. Like you're saying the differences in terms of how you all might have grown up and experienced or not. Cybernetic would look more at kind of the like disconnect that happens within the communication itself, right? So depending on what you focus on, you fit in either of those two. But definitely, right, interpersonal communication dynamics are fascinating. There's a good chance that if there's a topic you're interested in, that there is a study that has done some kind of interpersonal work looking at those kinds of relationships and communication across different, right? Cultural might play into that too. So I wanted to have you all work on this and share some examples just to highlight the array of combinations and ways that putting those two things together helps us to understand where theory might be useful, right? If we want to understand, as JP brought up, how a brand is communicating, for instance, to a larger public audience, there are a lot of theories in public relations, organizational communication theory, and so on, to help us to look at the persuasiveness of those messages. If we're looking at, as Jessica brought up, the cultural differences between two people and the ways in which those are communicated interpersonally, there'll be theories, for instance, space negotiation theory, that get into those things too. So there are a lot of permutations to look at here. And I think understanding that for each chapter, they're going to identify the tradition and context. Keep that in the back of your mind as you're working through the theories in this class, because that'll help us to situate when theories are being used. Because there are some theories that are meant to be interpersonal and don't make a lot of sense when you put it into a public or rhetorical context. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about theory, right? I asked you on the first day of class to share an example of theory. A couple folks brought up like the Big Bang Theory, right? Or another example, right, is a theory as to what killed the dinosaurs. Was it an asteroid? There are a lot of different approaches and perspectives, right? So a theory is this idea of an abstract system of concepts, right? It is abstract, that is, it's generalizable, right? A theory tries to be as broad as possible to be used in as many situations as possible. And it uses concepts, right, or terms that are related to that theory. It shows us the relationship between those ideas or terms that help us understand a phenomenon or issue, right? So, for instance, if we're using something like face negotiation theory in the class, we have to understand what this idea of face or reputation or face saving are, right? We don't know what face is in the context of that theory unless we break down and understand those concepts and the ways that those things connect to each other. For instance, next week, we'll be looking at symbolic interaction theory. As a part of that, we'll need to understand what self is, what the looking glass self is, and how our conceptions of the self are shaped by our social relationships. So you can think about it as like each theory has a set of terminology or words that link together to make that theory make sense. For instance, one theory or approach is the rhetorical situation that says that there's an exigence or imperfection marked by urgency, and that there are constraints or limitations on a speaker who's addressing an audience, right? When it comes to concepts, as we'll talk about in the class, they can be nominal. That is, things that we cannot necessarily observe, right? This term gets used a lot in economics, like nominal versus real numbers, right? We can't necessarily observe pi, but we can identify the numbers and the ways that those numbers are used to indicate how to measure a symbol. So in the first class, I took some time to talk about sort of the so what of theory, why we do theory and why it matters, right? And this idea here that theory is not necessarily up here in this ivory tower separated from the world, but the theory are tools that let us understand and engage, right? This idea that theory leads to action, which leads to reflection, that leads to more action, or the term praxis, which is theory in action, right? Or theory being used. For instance, if you're like a preschool teacher and you find yourself really interested in interactive, like hands-on styles of teaching, you aren't going to just learn about those things and then not teach it, right? You would actually have your students like build a garden or make a house out of popsicle sticks or do something fun. You would apply and use the things that you've learned if you learned that like hands-on interactive things are good for kids learning, right? In the same way, theory serves a lot of functions. Theory helps us explain or understand the world, right? As human beings, we love patterns. We like when things make sense and are organized for us. Theory helps us to do that because theory provides a prediction or explanation of what will happen, right? For instance, we know that there have been, over the course of our history, a lot of disasters, whether they've been natural disasters, foreign or domestic policy disasters, and so on, right? Oftentimes we like to do a kind of autopsy of those to figure out what went wrong. Maybe you got a paper back in the class, you got a bad grade. You look at your feedback and sort of figure out what you could do to improve on that, right? You're using it to explain and understand a little bit better. Understanding matters too. We use theory to make sense of the world, especially when we're communicating across different culture. Communication theory helps us to predict, right? Past is prologue. So for instance, when we are looking at, for instance, The way that we have approached COVID-19, COVID-19 has been very unprecedented, right? When we look at its history, we know that there have been pandemics that have happened in the past too. For instance, we might look at the way that we dealt with things like Spanish flu, influenza, and so on, right? And while there's a lot of differences in terms of technology and change over time, how we might have approached that in the past might help us to understand policies in the present. And theory can be used as a tool or resource for social change. This can be a challenging thing to walk, right? Because again, if we are just in theory and we're not really engaging in the world, that can be a problem. So one of the tricks is always making sure that the theories that we use align with the events that are happening in the real world, right? For instance, some theories related to media and the use of technology are way different than they used to be. There are a lot of people who thought that, for instance, a phone with a touch screen wasn't going to catch on, or the internet was just a fad, right? And obviously those theories have fallen by the wayside. So we need to think about how theory responds to or doesn't interact with current events. You'll notice over the course of this class, as we go through each theory, that they have what are considered 3 different approaches. These approaches are positivistic and empirical, interpretive, and critical. Each of these theories kind of falling under this scientific method or approach, where you have a question, you're hypothesizing or predicting what will happen, you'll study or observe, you'll figure out a conclusion and result, and it just goes and goes, right? We're constantly building and learning. The positivistic and empirical approach suggests that there is an objective reality. Objectivity, things are, right? That this table exists and can be measured or understood as a table. That there are certain conditions in the world that we all can agree are correct for truth. This approach generally assumes different things about human behavior and interaction as a given. An interpretive approach, right, suggests that we are making sense of reality, making sense of the world, right? We have a lot of information and lived experiences, and these theories are more focused on how we're fitting those experiences together. It has a lot of connection to phenomenological approaches. And then lastly, critical, right, focused on power, social change, and similar related issues. So each of these approaches you'll find as we're working through the theories in the class will be highlighted. You might see that it's a positivistic theory, which means it's been a very hard science approach, or it's an interpretive theory that is more about how we make sense of reality, right? So you'll see those things being highlighted in class. One of my favorite TV shows is BoJack Horseman, and there's a joke in this show about how, what do we know? Do we know things? Let's find out. And it's this like TV show name that's very silly. But that's actually a way that I, like, as a mental note, remember epistemology, right? So how do we know things? How do we know about the world? That can be informed by a few different perspectives. So epistemology is how we come to acquire knowledge. Where did that knowledge come from, right? So how many people have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Bell for a few folks. Yes, this was done by Philip Zimbardo. And this was an experiment in which people were randomly assigned as inmates or as wardens of a prison. And the purpose of that study was to understand people's behavior and psychology were they to assume those roles. However, there was some pretty significant controversy, backlash, and even lawsuits emerged because of the long-term psychological damage that came from that study. There are ethical questions about how we acquired and received that knowledge and whether it is ethical to use that knowledge, right? There are also, for instance, ethical questions about the use of research or information that might have emerged from scientists in Nazi Germany, right? But the question of how we come to acquire and use knowledge, right, is a question of epistemology. How do we know what we know? Where do we get our knowledge from? Ontology is about identity. It's about being and becoming. Who are we? How do we know who we are, right? We define who we are in terms of our identity and ontology on the basis of the labels and categories that we're assigned. We might choose to accept or reject, right, that help us define who we are. For instance, right, at birth, one of the first ways that we are ontologically assigned is through birth certificate. It says certain things about us when we're born. And then axiology is more about a question of ethics and values, right? How do we come to value or see certain issues as important? And of course, depending on culture and situation, we'll see a lot of disagreements there about knowledge in that regard. The last major thing that I want to hit on for this class, apologies for doing this, the clock doesn't work, so I'm just testing time on there, is how we test and use theory, right? So over the course of this class, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different theories. Some of them are going to be useful. Others we're going to critique or maybe not see as quite as important. And you'll notice that each chapter does some work to identify some of the strengths and shortcomings of each theory that we can think of, right? One of them is scope. So if a theory is too broad in scope, it's biting off more than it can chew, right? It's not necessarily very useful. It's too broad, it's too vague and unclear, it can't be applied. It has a lot of terms, but you don't really know how to use the terms. There's actually a critique of scope in next week's theory that we'll talk about. Also, right, if it's too narrow, if it's too niche, if the theory is only relevant in some very specific situations, that can be an issue with scope too. Ideally, theory is designed to be used in a lot of different situations, but also is defined enough that it's not totally vague and unclear. Logical consistency is a question of whether or not the theory hangs together. So, right, if you were to say in a theory that, you know what, I think that students at EOU really like drinking Diet Coke, right? And I assumed that. Where is that assumption coming from? What data did I use to support that? And what actually makes that true? So logical consistency can be an issue if the theory doesn't make sense internally. There's also a question of parsimony, right? Parsimony is about simplicity. If a theory is too complicated, if it has a ton of terms that are overly complicated and don't make a lot of sense, it's going to take too long to understand and be able to use the theory, right? The theory is designed for things like social change, other related social issues, in addition to being used to understand things. And it's too confusing for us to understand, then it doesn't work, right? One thing to remember for this, and I would say for a lot of other classes, is yes, there's time that goes into reading and understanding authors and work that might be a little abstract or not approachable, but sometimes there's just bad writing, right? Sometimes an author has not put together a coherent thought and lacks the parsimony necessary for that theory to make sense. Utility, right, is a question of how usable and helpful that theory is. For example, things like organizational culture theory are super utilitarian because oftentimes an organizational group is going to develop a company culture. They're going to create a brand. They're going to create a common space or little activities or inside jokes or like an award show they do every year to try to get people creating a company culture. Testability, right, are the terms or ideas that are developed in this theory things that we can test and observe in the world. Scientific process is about experimentation and whether or not we understand and make sense of the information that we have, right? Purism is a question of how much a theory is being used, right? So theories are ideally like snowballs. They build and build, they roll down the slope, right? And they get used more and more, added to, complicated, changed in various ways, and so on. Rhetoric is an example of a theory with a lot of purism. It goes all the way back to the Greeks, and we still use it to this day to describe persuasion and influence. And then lastly, test of time. Has the theory endured? Is it still being used today, right? That test helps us to determine if a theory still makes sense and still can be used. Sometimes theories are outdated as we've evolved and changed, for instance, through the use of media, right? So these tests will all be identified as we're working through chapters in the book. But I also encourage you to think about some of these ways of testing theory on your own too, including ways that they might not be mentioned or brought up within the chapter and theory itself. So to wrap up, I know it's a little bit more lecture focused today, but there's a lot of kind of core groundwork we have to do before we dive into theory. I promise you'll hear my voice a little bit less as we get closer into the quarter. We talked a little bit about the traditions and context, and we'll share some of those to identify the differentiating ways that we do communication. We talked about the process of developing theory, a systematic process that happens through scientific methods, experimentation, and work, and also how we research and test theory to make sense of whether or not theory is good, needs change, or thrown out altogether. Next class, on Monday, we will start with our first theory, which is symbolic interaction theory. I'll share some background, I'll show an extended example of the theory in action, we'll do some activities related to that theory too. Make sure that you are securing access to a textbook by that time. We're jumping ahead to chapter 15 for that theory next week. And go ahead and either pass forward or email me the prompt that you worked on for today and make sure that your name is on it. Have a great weekend. I hope that your first week of classes has gone really well. Make sure to turn in your quiz by the end of the day on Sunday. Remember, if you see anything weird on the internet, they will fool. So have a great weekend. I'll see you again next week. Yeah, thank you.